We're going to start with carbohydrates, which are one of the main food groups that we need to supply our bodies with. They're important because they are the body's main fuel for supplying cells with energy. And if we remember, cells get their energy through aerobic respiration. And they get it by oxidizing the sugar glucose. The sugar glucose is what makes up all carbohydrates. It is the most basic sugar, the most basic carbohydrate. This is what a molecule of glucose looks like. It is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, which are what carbohydrates are made up of. Carbohydrates, the word is made up of two parts. The first part, carbo, which is from carbon, and the second part, hydrate. Hydration means moisture and water, which is H2O. So it is hydrated carbon, carbohydrates. So we have carbon atoms and H2O, which means we have hydrogen and oxygen atoms as well, carbohydrates. So this is glucose, the most basic carbohydrate, and what the body uses for energy. We don't only have glucose, we have different forms of carbohydrates, the simplest form of which is glucose. Now, where do we find this glucose? We find it in vegetables and in fruits. It is called glucose. It is the simplest form of carbohydrates. Glucose is a monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide refers to sugar, so it is one molecule, glucose. The second type is found, for example, in milk, and it is called lactose. In milk, the sugar that we find is called lactose. It is made up of two sugars fused together, a molecule of glucose and a molecule of a sugar called galactose will make one molecule of lactose. So lactose is a disaccharide, di means two, and saccharide refers to sugar, which means lactose is a molecule made up of two sugars, glucose and galactose. In fruits, we also find a form of sugar called fructose, and not just glucose on its own. Fructose is also a monosaccharide like glucose. It is not a combination of different sugars. It is one molecule of sugar on its own, but it's just a different form of sugar. Now, in the sugar that we use for cooking, for example, and in sodas, we have a form of sugar called sucrose. Sucrose is soluble in water and it tastes sweet. This is the sugar that we use on a daily basis, the sugar we find in our kitchens. It is actually called sucrose. It is a disaccharide, like lactose, but this time it is not made up of glucose and galactose, it is made up of glucose and fructose. So glucose and fructose are monosaccharides. Together, they make the disaccharide sucrose. If we take in a lot of sucrose, it will cause tooth decay, and that is because the bacteria that is found in our mouth breaks down this sucrose and produces acid, and this acid stays on our teeth, and it is actually what causes the tooth decay. This is what tooth decay looks like. It is caused by taking in excessive amounts of sucrose. We also have a form of sugar that is different from the ones that we have discussed so far. It is found in, for example, potatoes, and it is, if you remember when we discussed plants, the starch. It is found in the cell walls of plants, and it is found especially in potatoes. Now, starch is an insoluble molecule. It is not soluble in water, like sucrose, for example. And it needs to be insoluble because it makes up the cell wall, and the cell is constantly taking in water. If starch is soluble, then the cell wall would dissolve. It is made up of a long chain of hundreds of glucose molecules. So it's not a disaccharide, it's not made up of two molecules, it's made up of a long chain of hundreds of glucose molecules. So we call it a polymer. Poly means many. It is a polymer of glucose. So starch is not a monosaccharide, it is not a disaccharide, it is a polysaccharide, since poly means many. It is made up of many molecules of sugar. Starch comes from plant resources. As we said, it is found in the cell wall of plants. We cannot find it from animal resources. The sugar that we find from animal resources, from meat for example, is called glycogen. It is the polysaccharide of glucose that is stored in animals. So glycogen is a polymer of glucose also, but it's different from starch because it comes from animal resources. So when we eat meat, the sugar or the polysaccharide that we get is glycogen. We have also another polymer of glucose, which is called cellulose. It is made up of many molecules of glucose, so it is also a polysaccharide. It can't be digested by humans because our gut doesn't make the enzyme needed to break down cellulose. So we don't make the enzyme to break down cellulose, so we can't digest it. But that doesn't mean that it's not important for us to eat. It is important because it forms dietary fiber or roughage. So it forms a mechanical help for digestion. It helps the gut muscles to push against as the food is moved through the intestine. So it has a mechanical role in digestion because the enzymes do not break it, so it stays as a big molecule that will help break down other molecules because the gut is moving everything together. It helps prevent serious diseases of the intestine like colitis and bowel cancer. So cellulose, even though we don't digest it and take it into our blood, it is very important to constantly eat so that we always have it in our digestive system.